Alright guys, let's get ready to put on our occult observation goggles. We follow a young woman as she goes to university and becomes subsumed into the elite underworld of the Netherlands. We have 4 pairs of shoes. Got some sneakers, some normal everyday wear, and we also have this lion here in the background, this lion teddy bear, which is interesting because we talked about the significance of teddy bears and tiger teddy bears in the previous series on Eyes Wide Shut. I don't know if this teddy bear has any bearing upon what is going to happen, but in Eyes Wide Shut we see the teddy bears before Helena is taken away by members of the secret society. In Eyes Wide Shut, Stanley Kubrick shows us an elite New York-based secret society whose members convene in a big, sumptuous mansion in the outskirts of the city, where they go to release the demons that they keep penned up behind their public show of cordiality, sociability, and feigned humanity. But while Eyes Wide Shut is set in North America, the hidden sphere of power and influence that Kubrick is exploring and exposing here is culturally much broader and historically much deeper than the United States. He indicates this throughout the movie through the symbols of the Order, the masks they wear, the places they go, and the ethnicities of the members. At the townhouse mansion of one of the members, we see the staff Ishtar, the Luciferic sex-born money goddess of Babylon, where the bank system employed by the financial elite was developed. And then we have the countryside mansion, where we see the members wearing both masks that may or may not be representations of actual people, as well as Venetian masks, which were popular within the elite circles of Vienna, where the book that Eyes Wide Shut is based on takes place. And by the way guys, I'm well aware that Venice and Vienna are 2 different places, but the situation is that the Venetian masks from Italy were highly popular amongst the elite circles of Vienna. So just to clarify that, because there were a few of you guys who watched the previous video who pointed that out. And then there's of course the mansion itself, where the ceremony takes place. Now this mansion, or at least the outside of the mansion that we see, is actually Mentmore Towers, which was originally built for the Rothschilds, the European banking family out of Frankfurt, who are based in several places in the world, including France, but mainly Britain. And then there is of course the multicultural membership of the Order.
My name is Sandor Savos. I'm Hungarian.
That is not to say that the European secret society scene has not gotten its fair share of attention. I mean, just look at the Freemasons out of Scotland, who people are talking about all the time. And then of course we have the Cathars out of France, who have also received quite a bit of attention, especially because of Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. And we of course have the Bavarian Illuminati, who people are quite obsessed with, or rather the sort of egregoric presence of a presumed global successor simply called the Illuminati. But next to no one pays any attention to the secret societies in a certain small European country that just so happens to have invented global capitalism, the stock market, and the corporate structure employed by mega corporations today. I am, of course, talking about the Netherlands, a Western European country roughly the size of Maryland. But despite their tiny little size, they're actually the fourth biggest exporter of goods behind Germany, the United States, and China, with an annual GDP of $1.3 trillion, which is more than all of these European countries combined. How is that possible? In the words of Carmen Spangenburg, member of the Dutch Secret Society that we shall soon get acquainted with.
Ga zitten. Heb je je nooit afgevraagd hoe het kan dat zo'n klein landje als Nederland zo rijk en machtig is geworden?
There are of course several reasons for this. Just look at the Dutch company ASML, the most valuable European tech company and arguably the most critical tech company globally, since they're the sole producer of a machine that produces the most complex computer chips in the world that all the major tech companies and all complex computer platforms are dependent upon, and without which the tech industry would suffer a catastrophic multi-decade collapse. Then there's the port of Rotterdam, the largest seaport in Europe and the leading port in the Western world in total cargo tonnage. This gateway into Europe is a primary entry point for goods serving some 500 million Europeans. While these are the most outwardly recognizable pillars of the disproportionately dominant Dutch economy, the biggest pillars are domestic, namely private and government spending, not to mention their export, notably agriculture, which they are the second largest exporter of after the US, despite their tiny size. Now, while we from an exoteric economic perspective can look at the pillars that are holding up the temple that is the Dutch economy, there is a much deeper and darker foundation that is the true, you can say, blueprint for why the Netherlands are so disproportionately economically dominant. And that blueprint was laid back in the 1600s when the first mega corporation was created, namely the VOC, which is commonly known as the Dutch East India Company. Now this company is the reason for why we have global capitalism today, the reason why we have a stock market today, the reason why we have the corporate structure that we are seeing today. And that is because the Netherlands, following their revolt against Spain, sought to establish themselves as a maritime power. In this endeavor, they opened up the funding of the company to the public, and that is how the Amsterdam Stock Exchange was created. And this is the first time that the public could buy shares in a company in an endeavor like this that wasn't funded exclusively by royalty and aristocracy. Now, this company was not really a company, or at least it was not a company in the usual sense. In fact, it would be more correct to say that it was a state within a state. In fact, the government of the Netherlands gave the VOC the mandate to basically do what they wanted. They could mint their own currency, they could establish financial treaties with monarchs from other countries, they could raise their own army, they could set up colonies, and because of this, they became immensely powerful, immensely influential. They ended up becoming not only the first international mega corporation in history, but the most profitable ever. At the height of its power in the 17th century, it controlled half of European trade with Asia and was worth $8 trillion, which is significantly more than Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, and Disney combined. Now, when they eventually collapsed in the end of the 1700s, the families who ran the VOC didn't just disappear. In fact, they transitioned from maritime capitalism to domestic finance, politics, and academia. During this shift, the VOC families became the primary creditors to the newly formed Dutch kingdom. Furthermore, in order to consolidate their power amongst themselves, they formed ultra-exclusive student societies at top universities, what are collectively known as the corpora. These student societies followed the VOC's state-within-a-state model by functioning as miniature states with their own internal senate. This is where the sons of the elite learned the VOC way of corporate and financial power. And so the VOC didn't disappear, but simply found another way, another arena, a domestic arena, to maintain and execute their power. You see, they wanted to really sort of go from ruling the seas to ruling the Netherlands and having a big impact in Europe still, but while operating from the homeland. These student secret societies, such as the LSV Minerva, was a way for the children, the descendants of the families who ran the VOC, to consolidate their power, right? So these young people, to begin with, only the sons of these wealthy families, would enter these fraternities to create solidarity and in-group favoritism. And in fact, these student secret societies were basically developed according to the VOC state within a state model. They have their own president, they have their own senate. So it really is sort of like a state within a state, right? It's operating according to its own values, its own rituals, and its own hierarchy. Back then, if you wanted to enter a position in politics or diplomacy, you had to do it through the corpora, which is the collective term for these fraternities. And that is largely even the case today, when upwards estimate of 2/3 of all the people in top positions in finance and politics and what have you, being members of these student societies. That includes former prime ministers, former CEOs, EU commissioners, former European central bankers. Even the Dutch king himself, King Willem-Alexander, is a former member of one of these student societies. And so is his eldest daughter, the future queen, Princess Amalia. And in fact, the princess may or may not have a character that represents her in the show that we are going to talk about today. That show is Aries, a Netflix show that goes deep into esoteric elitism and that's so disturbing that most couldn't finish it when it first came out. And that after its dark and enigmatic appearance went completely under the radar, as if people didn't really know what had just hit them. Nowhere was this more the case than in the Netherlands itself, where a good chunk of the proud public were massively triggered about what the show was unveiling, and that is a very dark part of their history, and in fact a very dark part of the very foundation of their current society. But in this video series, we're not going to shy away from the show's ever more enveloping darkness, nor the disturbing theme that is unveiling. Instead, I'm going to give it the eyes wide shut treatment it deserves, because what we're dealing with here is a show with great detail richness, that's deeply esoteric, and that explores a Dutch elite that not only has a massive influence over the Netherlands' 16 square miles, but the wider world itself, whose financial globalism its corporate founding families pioneered. So regardless of why you're here, whether you are here because you are genuinely curious about, the Dutch secret society underworld, or you want to find out whether or not you want to watch the show, or maybe you enjoyed our Eyes Wide Shut series, then I bid you welcome. And without further ado, let's board our ship and sail to Amsterdam and talk about Aries. Alright guys, let's get ready to put on our occult observation goggles, because this show is highly detail rich. And in fact, I'm gonna stop here with the first shot, where we have 4 pairs of shoes. Got some sneakers, some normal everyday wear, and we also have this lion here in the background, this lion teddy bear, which is interesting because we talked about the significance of teddy bears and tiger teddy bears. I think this might be a lion in the previous series on Eyes Wide Shut. I don't know if this teddy bear has any bearing upon what is going to happen, but in Eyes Wide Shut we see the teddy bears before Helena is taken away by members of the secret society. And in this prologue we follow a young woman as she goes to university and becomes subsumed into the elite underworld of the Netherlands. So that could well be significant. Another thing that is significant is the role of the sun in the story. We already see that here shining through, and we actually see the light very much sort of being guided towards this black pair of stilettos, which are indeed the shoes that she's going to take, because she's going to join a very elite student secret society, and you gotta look the part. But we have many details here, some of which might be important. We got the ladder in the background. This young woman is very much a social climber, right? She's entering the corpora, it's called, right? The secret society system that is very integrated into the university system. So that could be evocative of that. Then we have this, whatever this is, hanging behind her. What I feel like kind of looks like a witch. It might be influenced by what I know is going to happen in the show and a certain character that is going to show up in the show. But let me know, guys, is this evocative of a witch perhaps? I don't know. But anyway, pay attention to the role of light and shadow in this prologue, and indeed in the rest of the show, because far from just being a cinematographic, visual texture to the story, it's very much an execution of the theme of the story, right? But just pay attention to that. And also, one mythology, one archetypal journey that you can keep in mind as you watch this prologue unfold is the story of Persephone. You're probably familiar with this story, it's quite popular these days. In the story, she begins as a maiden called Kor. Kor means maiden, and she's just out and about with her friends, looking at flowers, just enjoying their life in the sun-draped upper world. When the earth opens up, Hades flies out, grabs her and takes her into the underworld. Her journey is very evocative of that. She begins the story as this rosy-cheeked, bright-eyed, innocent girl who is going to university and is super excited about starting her life there. But she is being subsumed into this very, very dark, elite underground of Amsterdam. And I very much see the sunlight that is bathing upon her as being evocative of her connection to her purity, to her soul, basically, right? The sun in esoteric philosophy, whether we look at alchemy or astrology, represents the soul. And of course, what happens to these young people as they join these secret societies is that is the thing that they want them to be severed from. Because in order to participate in this this new life, they cannot have moral gripes about what they're doing. They cannot be people of high ethical standards. They must very much become corrupted in order to participate in this new world. And that's what we see already here with this hazing ritual that she's undergoing. So these are members of this secret society, the secret student society, that are currently taking these neophytes through this hazing ritual. And what we see is that they're wearing white t-shirts, right? White evoking their purity, their innocence. And what we see here is how their white t-shirts have already been smudged by dirt, evoking how their state of purity is already undergoing the process, the ceremonial process of corruption. And you'll notice a lot of kneeling in this show when it comes to these new members, or these aspiring members, right? And this is both to humiliate them, to bring them down, but it's also to evoke how you have to learn how to crawl before you can walk. Because what they're undergoing and what initiation, whether it is a sort of positive initiation into a higher state of consciousness or one to a lower state of consciousness, regardless of what it is, whether it is towards the light or whether it is towards darkness, you undergo a rebirth, right? You die to your old self to be reborn into a new self. And here we have one of the most prominent student members of the society, and that is Carmen Svanenburg. Right? And you'll notice that she's wearing some very interesting outfits in this show that seems very aristocratic and harkens back centuries back in time. But what I want to point out here is the orange of the shirt, because orange is the national color of the Netherlands, despite the fact that orange is not even on the flag. And the reason for this is that William of Orange was the one who led the Dutch revolt against Habsburg Spain, and his color, or the color of his house, was put upon the flag as a representation of him and as a representation of rebellion, right? So this color evokes, yes, the Netherlands, but the spirit of rebellion, because it was the spirit of rebellion that liberated the Netherlands from the Spanish control. So it's an interesting feature here. So just pay attention to the characters wearing orange are likely to have a spirit of rebellion within them. What that spirit of rebellion is, you will have to watch to find out. Again, we still have the sun, right? She's now getting into like more of the darkness here, right? But the sun is still there, right? She's still rosy cheeked, she's still connected to her purity and innocence. But as we talked about, she has to undergo a rebirth, right? She has to die to her own pure self. So we see her crawling here through a cloth tunnel, very much evoking the birth canal, right? She's making her way, again, kneeling, right? She's not learned how to walk yet in this new world. She's moving through this symbolic birth canal and is going to emerge on the other side as a member of this student secret society. And I think actually that this was the last shot where we see her face in like the warm glow of sunlight. Right, we see that here. See the sunlight here. And actually, interestingly enough, this lens flare that we see is actually the symbol of Tiferet in Kabbalah, the solar sphere. And we're dealing here with some sacred geometry, but you can see here how it's actually a hexagram. And that is the symbol of Tiferet. If you place the hexagram over Tiferet on the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, you can see how it connects to the different spheres around it. Tiferet is the solar sphere of the soul. So I believe this is the last time we see her face bathed in the warm glow of sunlight, because in the next shot, we see how she's turned away from the sunlight, right? So the sunlight is out here, but now she's facing the lodge house, and we're already seeing her face being clad vaguely in shadow. And this trend away from the sun and towards shadow is going to continue in this prologue. And we also see the color of the order, which is blue. Blue is one of the colors on the Dutch flag. It's a color denoting loyalty. And in this situation, I don't think it's loyalty towards the Netherlands, but rather loyalty towards Aries, towards this secret society. And what is interesting is that these secret societies that make up the corpora each function as a state within a state, just as the VOC did. And remember, it was the descendants, right, of the VOC, the families of the VOC who founded these secret societies. So they have similar initiation ceremonies, similar hierarchies, and again, they function as units unto themselves. So they are very much isolated from the rest of Dutch society. And that is the reason why these members have to leave behind, the normal Dutch society self, their normal state of consciousness, in order to become members of this society. So the loyalty is first and foremost to the order, not the country. So this is not unique to the Netherlands, right? We have secret societies in Britain in America, and they function in similar ways and play similar functions. But what is quite unique about the Dutch student secret societies is that they do a lot of singing. They do a lot of group singing, and this is of course a way to become a unified voice, right? To become one word and one will. It's also a way to sort of express and embody and evoke certain values. These songs are also very old, so it ties them back in history to these past families, to the Dutch elite, back to the VOC. And of course, what would a Persephone narrative be without a Hades figure? Here we have Carmen's brother, and he is the son of the head of Ares. And again, Ares is a state within a state, right? So that means that if he's the son of the head of Ares, he's basically the prince, right? He's basically a prince-like figure. And Ares, of course, functions very much in the underworld, right? It's beneath the societal awareness of everyday people, right? So he's basically the prince of this society and essentially feels like he can do whatever he wants, right? And something that you will see a lot in the show is this oscillation between blue and red, blue and red. So we just had this scene where they were singing and they were wearing blue clothing. It was quite blue tinted, the scene. And now we are in a scene bathed in neon red. So we see that a lot. And that is that vacillation between the two colors in the Dutch flag, between the blue of loyalty and then the red of courage, valor, and here passion, right? And here we see the student members of Ares wearing the signature blue of the order, except Carmen, who's wearing black. And of course, these orders are very enmeshed in the university system, right? The student secret societies. And this goes back way back in time with the VOC, which was also highly entrenched in the university system. In fact, they used the university system in the Netherlands to give rise to a new elite, an elite that was trained to become administrators, lawyers, politicians, right? And so they used the university system to do that. And in fact, a lot of the professors at the universities were shareholders of the VOC. So they had a financial interest in the VOC doing well. And the VOC also funded a lot of departments at universities back in the day. And also one of the buildings at the University of Amsterdam, which is where we are right now, was the former headquarters of the VOC. So this connection between these secret societies and the university system goes back hundreds of years into the past.
Voor degene met de slapeloze nacht. Voor degene die het geluk niet kan beamen.
And here we have this drastic contrast between light and shadow, very Rembrandt-esque. And indeed the cinematography of the show is inspired by Rembrandt, who used a technique called chiaroscuro, which is this dramatic contrast between light and shadow. And this is not just a visual aesthetic, but a thematic expression of what the story is really about, right? So we're seeing her moving further away from the light, away from her soul, and deeper into the corruption and darkness of this order. So we are seeing her now being in that middle state, and the shadows will only become more all-enveloping. And there's going to be a scene here that is, if you guys watch the show, that is not very consensual. And here we see the first image of the logo of Ares. It's very interesting that they call the order Ares because its main color is blue. And of course, blue is a color that is more associated with sort of clear thinking, rationality, strategy. It's not so much a fiery color. And I guess it could be, right, because fire at a certain temperature becomes blue. But Ares, Mars, right, Ares is the Greek name for Mars, is very much symbolized by red. And that's the case also in Kabbalah, where the Martian sphere of Jebera is red. So, but it's curious because one of the main student secret societies in the Netherlands is LSV Minerva, and their color is also blue. And I think that's quite appropriate. Minerva, that is the Roman name for Athena, and she's very much also a war god, like Mars, like Ares, but a strategic type of war god. And she is very much an intellectual Olympian deity. But I find that curious that the order is named after a war god that, unlike Athena, who is again this more strategic, highly intellectual strategist, is more sort of the god of carnality, the carnality of battle. So, and another thing that is significant here is that if you turn this symbol upside down, it goes from an A to a V. And this, of course, evokes the VOC, whose members founded these student secret societies. And here she's becoming an initiate of the order. The pale, cold light of the order has substituted the warm, golden, orange light of the sun. She's now disconnected from her own soul, right, from the sun, and is now an initiate of the order. And to become that, you need to have that connection severed. And here we have the final scene in this prologue. She casts one last look out of the sun-clad world that she has left behind. And I'm not going to show you what happens next, but she basically grabs a scissor and stabs out her own eyes like Oedipus. And this stabbing of the eyes is of course very significant because Oedipus did exactly that so that he wouldn't have to look his father and mother in the eye in the afterlife out of the shame and guilt that he was feeling. And indeed, shame and guilt are key topics that this story is exploring. And in fact, I believe the first line of the series contains those two words.
Schaamte, schuldgevoel.
There we go.